presented by Auraverse, where consciousness, earth, and inner wisdom move as one. Showcase your work at auraverse.network and let your voice travel across worlds.
Before we begin, let your attention settle, just for a moment, on the simple fact that you are aware. Thoughts move, sensations change, but this clear space of knowing remains. For Avicenna, that clarity in you is not an accident. It is a faint echo of a far greater intellect. Welcome. I am C.S. Douglas, and this is Codex Æternum, the Rational Bible, a journey through the hidden architecture of power and the living conscience of the universe.
This program is endorsed by Authorpedia, the world's only encyclopedia exclusively dedicated to authors, a living archive where writers and thinkers are immortalized through literature. Visit authorpedia.org and become part of our enduring legacy.
In Book 6, The Sages, we continue episode 97, Avicenna and the Human Intellect as a reflection of the Divine Intellect. Imagine the Islamic Golden Age not as a romantic slogan, but as a real landscape. Cities lit by oil lamps, libraries overflowing with manuscripts, astronomers charting the heavens, physicians dissecting the logic of disease, philosophers arguing late into the night about the nature of being itself. In this world, a young man named Ibn Sīnā, whom the Latin West will later call Avicenna, moves like a comet. By his teens, he has devoured the medicine, mathematics, and philosophy of his age. By his 20s, he is already treating rulers, editing Aristotle in his head, and beginning to shape a vision of the human mind that will echo for 1,000 years. For Avicenna, the human intellect is not just a clever animal trick. It is a ray from a greater sun. The divine intellect, in his picture, is the luminous source of all forms, truths, and possibilities. The human mind participates in that source, not as its equal, but as its reflection. Think of sunlight striking a mirror. The mirror does not generate the light. It receives it, clarifies it, and sends it back into the room. In the same way, Avicenna sees the human intellect as a polished surface through which divine intelligibility enters the world. But how does that light reach us? Here Avicenna introduces one of his most famous ideas, the active intellect. You can think of it as a kind of intermediary field, an ever-present broadcast of intelligible form, always shining, always available. When our own mind is prepared, through study, concentration, and the discipline of attention, it tunes in to this broadcast. Knowing, then, is not just taking snapshots of the outside world, it is a meeting between the prepared mind and a luminous order that is already there. We are not inventing truth from scratch. We are discovering what the divine intellect is continuously thinking. Avicenna maps this process in stages. There is the potential intellect, like a blank page that could receive any writing. There is the actual intellect, engaged in learning, turning possibilities into specific acts of understanding. And there is the acquired intellect, where truths have become so deeply assimilated that the mind stands in stable, luminous contact with the higher source. At that highest level, the intellect does not merely possess knowledge. It is knowledge, transparent to the forms it grasps, like clear glass filled with light. For Avicenna, this ascent of the intellect is a spiritual journey. The soul is, by nature, rational. Its dignity lies in understanding. Every time the mind turns away from trivia and toward what is necessary, universal, and eternal, it loosens the grip of the merely material. It becomes less scattered, less enslaved to impulse and habit, and more aligned with the order of the divine intellect. This is why study, for Avicenna, is not a dry academic chore. It is a form of purification. To think clearly about what is real is to cleanse the mirror of the soul. At the extreme end of this spectrum lie the prophets. Avicenna dares to suggest that prophecy itself can be understood within this intellectual framework. The prophet, in his view, is a human being whose intellect is so perfectly balanced and polished that the active intellect can pour truth into it without distortion. But because most of us do not live on that altitude, the prophet does something more. He translates these luminous insights into images, laws, and narratives that ordinary minds can grasp. Symbol, ritual, and story become the clothing of a truth that, in itself, is blindingly abstract. In this way, Avicenna refuses to oppose philosophy and revelation. Reason and prophecy are two modes of the same descending light. The philosopher climbs toward it through argument and contemplation. The prophet receives it as a kind of direct irradiation, then bends it down into the forms of a culture. All of this rests on Avicenna's deeper metaphysics. He draws a sharp distinction between essence, what a thing is, and existence, that it is. Every created thing, from stones to stars, has an essence that does not explain its own existence. It might or might not be. It is contingent. If everything were like that, we would be left with an infinite regress, a chain of borrowed being with no original owner. So Avicenna argues there must be a necessary existent, a being whose very essence is to exist, who does not receive being from another. This necessary existent is what religious language calls God. From that necessary source flows the entire hierarchy of being and intellect, the celestial spheres, the separate intellects, the active intellect, and finally the rational soul of each human being. The structure is elaborate, but the intuition is simple. Existence cascades, intelligibility cascades, and the human mind is one of the final mirrors where that cascade comes to self-awareness. Avicenna's genius does not stop at metaphysics. He is also a physician, and in his Canon of Medicine, he organizes and expands the medical knowledge of his time with a rigor that will make his book a standard text in both the Islamic world and Latin Europe for centuries. He insists on systematic observation, on careful differentiation of diseases, on hygiene and quarantine, on testing remedies rather than accepting them on authority alone. For him, the same divine intellect that structures the cosmos also expresses itself in the intelligible order of the human body. To treat illness, then, is to cooperate with that order, to understand how the body's systems are meant to function and how they fall out of balance. Medicine becomes applied metaphysics, a practical compassion informed by a belief that nature is rational and therefore readable. Avicenna even ventures into what we would now call psychology. He recognizes that the state of the mind affects the body, and that emotions, imagination, and belief can contribute to both disease and healing. Once again, the intellect is the key. A confused or disordered mind radiates that confusion into the organism. A mind trained in clarity and aligned with truth supports health. In all these domains, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, a single pattern repeats. Reality is intelligible. The human intellect is capable of grasping that intelligibility, and the more deeply it does so, the more it becomes a living reflection of the divine intellect from which all order flows. Avicenna's influence will spread far beyond his own language and era. His works are translated into Latin, studied in medieval universities, argued with and absorbed by figures like Thomas Aquinas and Albert the Great. When Renaissance thinkers speak of the dignity of reason, and when early modern scientists assume that nature can, in principle, be understood, they are walking, often unknowingly, on paths Avicenna helped to clear. For us, his message lands like this. Your intellect is not a cold, accidental flashlight in a meaningless universe. It is a small, finite, but genuine participation in a cosmic act of understanding. Every time you learn, every time you push past distraction into real insight, you are not only upgrading your personal toolkit, you are aligning a part of yourself with the very pattern by which reality is ordered. carry this revelation as a quiet practice. The next time you sit to read, to think, or to solve a problem, try treating that effort as a form of devotion. Imagine that by clarifying one idea, in logic, in medicine, in your own emotional life, you are polishing a tiny piece of the universe so that the light passing through it shines a little more clearly. You do not have to accept Avicenna's entire metaphysical system to feel the force of this. To honor your own capacity to understand is already to live as if the intellect were sacred, as if thinking could be a bridge between the human and the divine. In our next episode, we will rise one last time above the individual traditions and look at the great pattern as a whole. We will explore Chapter 7, the universal wisdom of the sages, those timeless truths and principles that shimmer through Egypt and China, through Greece and India, through prophets, philosophers, and mystics alike. There we will ask, what happens when we place all these teachings side by side and listen for the single song they have been singing all along?
Our next sponsor is Everly Books Publishing Group, a traditional independent press serving both new and established writers. Everly Books welcomes unsolicited manuscripts submitted directly through everlybooks.org.